This is a lecture on Old Testament critical methodologies, and in particular, for this lecture, form criticism, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Form criticism. Form criticism was invented by this gentleman here, a fellow gentleman by the name of Hermann Gunkel, a German Old Testament scholar. Form criticism is a means of analyzing the typical features of texts, especially their conventional forms and structures, in order to relate them to their sociological context. That's a formal definition of form criticism. Now, the method of form criticism begins with analyzing the structure of a text. Structure refers to the outline or pattern or schema of a text. And how this is analyzed is as follows. First of all, you establish pericopes. A pericope is a unit which can be read independently of the larger work in which it is incorporated. And form critics usually assume that pericopes were once independent oral units, that they were handed down by word of mouth and only later written down. That's often assumed. And they look for introductory or conclusion formulas that would mark where the pericopes begin and end, or the larger units would have a variety of pericopes begin and end. And they notice changes in genre. So does it change from prose to poetry or things of that sort? And that's a part of their analysis. Second, one should consider the genre pericopes within the larger unit. You'll notice this genre pericope, Gunkel uses the German word Gattung, and you'll run across that word from time to time. But you'll notice things like where you have prose and where you have poetry, and you'll ask, well, if it's prose or poetry, well, what type of prose is it? Or what type of poetry is this? And then you'll compare with similar examples in the Bible or from the biblical world. For example, you might compare with Hittite treaties, when you're looking at passages talking about the biblical covenant. And, well, Hittite treaties and biblical covenants have certain similarities. And so that would be a way of analyzing a Gattung by comparing similar examples. And the method assumes, and mostly correctly, that some genres are stereotyped. That is, it will tend to follow a particular type of pattern, kind of like a form letter in English, a business form letter, where you may start with an address, and then a date, and then the person being addressed, and their dear sir, and so on and so forth. They will tend to follow certain patterns. And then you'll define the setting for each genre unit. Now, this is kind of important. The German word for setting, by the way, that Gunkel uses is the expression Sitzenleben, and means the situation or setting in life. And what the setting is not a historical circumstance. That's where he's going to distinguish himself from the historical critics. He's not looking for a historical circumstance. He's looking for a place in Israel's sociological life where this material would be utilized. For example, if you have a civil law, well, civil laws are usually found in courtroom scenes. If you have a hymn, well, that's usually found in public worship. Could be in private worship, but more often in public worship. Proverbial sayings might be used in a setting where a father is giving advice to his children. Narratives could be used in the circle of storytellers. And so this is the setting he's looking for, not a historical circumstance, but a sociological setting where the material would have originally, at least, have been utilized. Related to the setting is the question, well, who is the speaker and who is the audience? That's important in the setting. And then fourth, establish the intention or the purpose or the function of the genre units of a text. What was the intention of the genre in its original setting? What was the function of the genre unit in the larger setting? And so a hymn might be used to praise God, but a hymn in the mouth of a character could be used to show the character's piety. Oh, he's a religious person. He sings hymns or the like. And so there might be a difference between the original sociological setting and the usage in the genre unit of the text. Now, one could illustrate how this could be used by looking at Psalm chapter 2. And when you look at Psalm chapter 2, you can find a structure. There's 4 strophes of 3 verses each. And in each strophe, you have a reference to God and a reference to the human king. And if you look at Psalm 2, you also get a change in speakers along the way. You have a narrator who starts, verses 1 through 5, but then he quotes God as saying something in verse 6. And then it looks like the king stands up and speaks in verses 7 through 9. And then it's a little unclear, but perhaps we switch back to the narrator or to remain with the king in verses 10 through 12. But you have at least a couple of speakers, the narrator and the king, who are distinguishable, and the narrator quotes God, and the king may or may not be the speaker of the last 4 verses, or last 3 verses. And so this is the psalm. I'm quoting from the NIV. Why did the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. I've installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. But then you get a change of speaker in verse 7, where the king stands up and speaks. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. And therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So you begin with a narrator, verses 1 through 5. He quotes God, who says, I've installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. And then the king speaks, saying what the decree of the Lord is. And again, the last verse is a little bit unclear whether it's the narrator or whether it continues with the king. And each stanza has 3 verses, strophe or stanza, 3 verses each into 4 different sections. Now, let's do a little bit of form criticism of chapter 2. First of all, genre pericopes. The psalm is a unity. It has only one genre pericope. In contrast with certain other psalms, such as Psalm 19, where verses 1 through 6 seems to be a hymn, while the rest of the psalm seems to be a wisdom psalm, which form critics posit to maybe have had a different origin from the first 6 verses. And then you can categorize Psalm 2 as a royal psalm. It's a royal psalm because it emphasizes the human king, which is described as God's anointed one. But then the question is, what is the Sitz und Leben of this psalm? In other words, how would it have operated in the sociological setting of Israel in the ancient past? And when one thinks about it, well, you have to kind of throw up a hypothesis. But the hypothesis that seems to make sense of everything is to say that this is a coronation psalm. In other words, this is a psalm which was used whenever they coronated a new king over Judah. And then you can start to explain the change of speakers. Perhaps this is a ritual where the priest is the narrator, and he, of course, speaks on behalf of God. But then the king stands up in the middle as a part of his part of the ritual and gives his part. Let me tell you the decree of the Lord. He has said to me, the king, you are my son today, today being the day of coronation, I have begotten you. And so I think this is probably a coronation psalm. And it's hard to find a plausible Sitz und Leben if the psalm is purely predictive of Messiah. It is predictive, but it's predictive in an indirect way rather than a direct way. It was a coronation psalm which celebrated what God was going to do through the Davidic monarchy, including all the kings of Judah up until King Messiah, is the way I would look at it. So it's indirectly predictive of Messiah. And so the argument then, the intention of this was to celebrate the divine election of the Davidic office at the enthronement of each new king. The Davidic promise included the promise in 2 Samuel 7 that the Davidic king would have a father-son relationship with God. And so here it is. They celebrate that, when he is coordinated as king, the decree of the Lord is to say that you now, by virtue of becoming king, are my son in this somewhat lesser sense. And this day being the day of coronation, I have begotten you. But it also includes God's plan for the Davidic office and kingdom. Ask of me, and I'll give the nations as your inheritance, the ends of the earth as your possession, and you'll break them like a rod of iron and shatter them like earthenware. Ultimately, the Davidic monarchy would have a kingdom that would be worldwide. Now, this part is only fulfilled in Jesus Christ, but it's what God planned for the Davidic office ultimately. And so, again, even in the statement that all the kings of Judah, according to 2 Samuel 7, you can read about that around verse 13, 14, thereabouts. All the kings of Judah had this special relationship with God, father-son type relationship with God. But when applied to Jesus Christ, the language has a far richer and deeper and more wonderful meaning, because Jesus is Son of God in a sense far greater than all the other Davidic kings were sons of God. He really is the Son of God that really does have God as his father in the virgin birth. So, how does form criticism relate to exegesis? Well, form criticism doesn't pretend to be a complete method, but just one element in the analysis of a passage. Form criticism doesn't intend to reject source criticism. Generally, Wellhausen accepted the basic structure of the Wellhausen source critical conclusions, but he was trying to come up with a methodology that could go beyond it, maybe go beyond the written sources to the oral stage of transmission of what ultimately became a part of the biblical text. Form criticism, like source criticism, though, is still a source-oriented approach. It tries to find oral traditions behind the sources, and it emphasizes the text's prehistory rather than emphasizing the text itself. There is a different assumption that it assumes that there must have been an oral stage. That is, there must have been a time in which the biblical traditions were handed down by word of mouth, whereas the older source critics put no emphasis on this possibility of oral transmission. Well, let's look at the strengths of form criticism and some of the weaknesses of form criticism. One of the strengths of form criticism is that it is helpful in its analysis of genres. It's a valuable thing to figure out, well, just exactly what kind of thing is this that I'm reading? Is it a proverb? Is it a prophetic oracle? Is it a historical narrative? Or just what is it? And form criticism has focused scholars' attention on the different genres in Scripture, and that is a useful thing to do. The other thing that it does that's kind of helpful is that it raises useful questions about the possible sociological settings of the genres. But then there are weaknesses. One weakness is that it assumes that the text had a long oral history before it came to be written down. And this is highly hypothetical. And if the assumption is wrong, then some of the conclusions that form critics draw from it are likely to be wrong as well. The prophets may have written their sermons down right after they spoke them, rather than having it handed down for a very, very long period of time. The historical books may not be folklore, as Gunkel identifies them as, with a long oral transmission, but could be based on written accounts by contemporaries to the events. And the written accounts were handed down instead. And again, form critics tend to be rationalists that downplay anything supernatural, but from a more conservative point of view, some of the accounts may be based on direct revelation from God rather than either oral or written sources. The other problem with source criticism or form criticism is that it tends to be atomistic. That is, they like to concentrate on the smallest literary units consisting of a single genre. In Psalm 2, it was a whole psalm, but it could be parts of a psalm. Chapter 2 of Jonah is a psalm. Chapter 3 of Habakkuk is a psalm. And they focus on these smallest literary units. But by considering the smallest literary unit, they often miss the artistic whole. In other words, they often skip the step that they claim they're supposed to do, finding from the smallest units the intention, purpose, and function. Now, if they do that fourth step four, then they're okay. But in practice, they can get so focused on the smallest literary units they never quite get around to looking how those small units fit into the literary work as a whole. Another weakness is that form critics have wrongly assumed that the Sitz und Leben is inherent in the form, that the Sitz und Leben is inherent in the form. Let's say, for example, you heard somebody say that Note caught the pass that Alt threw. And you could look at that and say, oh, well, that looks like, sports reporting, maybe a sports announcing. That's the form. And you'd expect that to be in maybe a sports broadcast or a article about a sporting event, a football event. But in fact, Note is a German Old Testament scholar, as was Alt, and Alt was a student of Note. And so this statement is really about biblical scholars. And so if you assume that the Sitz und Leben is inherent in the form, then you would get the wrong conclusion. This is not part of a sports reporting or a sports broadcast. It's language used metaphorically and creatively to express the idea that Note, the student of Alt, was highly influenced by him. He caught the pass that Alt threw, is the analogy. Thus, it's dangerous to reject the Bible's setting on the basis of a supposed Sitz und Leben in form. Also, as form critics themselves admit, form analysis is incomplete. It best yields a sociological setting. The historical setting is important too, and maybe far more important than this so-called sociological setting. And form critics can wrongly analyze a pericope's genre. Gunkel called the creation narratives myths, but we would not believe that they are myths. They wrongly categorize apocalyptic literature as entirely separate category from biblical prophecy, whereas I would say that apocalyptic literature is one subcategory of the prophecy genre. And so, again, you can wrongly analyze the genre and reach incorrect conclusions. And the Sitz und Leben established by form critics is often overly speculative. So, for example, is the Book of the Covenant, which are the laws of Exodus 21 through 23, is the Book of the Covenant really a Canaanite law code? That's what they think the Sitz und Leben of that work is, that it goes back to Canaanite courts. And we would argue, well, no, it's probably not Canaanite laws. But in any case, that's the sort of thing that form critics are likely to speculate about and often be overly speculative about. And they can wrongly assume that form is more important than content. And of course, what really accounts in the study of the text is the message that's being given. Insofar as form criticism can help us discern the message correctly, well and good, but the form is not more important than the message. The message is the really important thing. So anyway, that's a brief introduction to Old Testament form criticism.